You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Netflix. Jay Kelly, the new film from Academy Award nominee Noah Baumbach. George Clooney stars as an actor confronting his past and present on a journey of self-discovery, alongside Adam Sandler as his devoted manager. Critics are calling it a declaration of love to the chaotic art of filmmaking, with the Wall Street Journal praising it as a transcendent comedy drama. Jay Kelly is now playing only on Netflix.
Vitamin Water Zero Sugar has great taste, zero BS, and obviously zero sugar. For those with zero room in their calendar, zero patience for slow walkers, those who get 0 hours of sleep on a Saturday night, have zero filter, zero given, and zero interest in grabbing a plain, boring water. Grab a delicious Vitamin Water Zero Sugar today.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 243, North Africa 1940, part 7, Beda Fomm. This week, a big thank you goes out to Nancy, Andrew, and Tyler for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. After the capture of Bardia, the British had accomplished two significant things with their attack since the start of Operation Compass. The first was that they had pushed the Italians out of Egyptian territory, which they had captured earlier in 1940. And they had also captured the first major Italian stronghold along the Mediterranean coast of Libya. This was a tremendous success for an operation that was essentially planned to be nothing more than a raid. On the Italian side, the situation looked real bleak, with the Italian 10th Army down roughly 2/3 of its strength. However, for the course of the war, in the long term, the most important impact of the fall of Bardia had nothing to do with the British or the Italians, and instead would occur in Germany. After the fall of Bardia, and due to concerns about the ramifications of a British-controlled Libya and British control of the Mediterranean, Hitler would make the decision to send assistance to his ally. This decision would start the ball rolling towards the creation of the Deutsche Afrika Korps and its famous commander, Erwin Rommel, entering the war in North Africa. But their arrival would take time, and before that arrival, the Italians would lose even more territory to the British advance. Of all of the locations where fighting would occur in North Africa throughout the entire war, if you were to rank those locations by how famous they are, I'm not sure exactly where Tobruk would fall, but Tobruk has to be on the list somewhere. During early January 1941, it was held by the Italians, and it would be the next major target for the 6th Australian Division as they advanced to the west of Bardia. The main reason that Tobruk would be so important to the campaign over the following 2 years was because of its harbor, which the British commander, General O'Connor, wanted as a way for his troops to be supported by the Royal Navy as they continued to push further west. Tobruk was roughly twice the size of Bardia, and the Italians had spent the time to build up the defenses there so that they were similar to what they had constructed at Bardia, which the British had already defeated. This meant anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, and minefields, along with protected positions for Italian infantry and machine guns. The one major benefit that Tobruk had over Bardia was that the Italians had also brought some large naval guns ashore for the defense, which added to the available firepower. On the British side, the force makeup would be roughly the same, with the 6th Australian Division supported by the Matildas of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment. The Australians had surrounded Tobruk by January 10th, but they would be there 11 days before the final attack would be launched. This delay was required due to simply needing to bring up supplies, particularly in the form of artillery ammunition, which would be essential to the final attack when it was launched, but was just slow to get to the front. While the delay was required, there was also some level of urgency in the preparations, because even if the Italian forces in eastern Libya seemed to be on the ropes, there were reports that additional Italian forces were being assembled in Tripoli and that the Germans were possibly going to join the Italian invasion of Greece. At Tobruk, the infantry assault was planned to start just before 6 a.m. on January 21st, And so the day before, the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy made their presence felt in Tobruk by bombarding and softening up the garrison a little bit to prepare them for the attack the next day. At the appointed time the next morning, the artillery started firing, and much like at Bardia, engineers were sent forward to begin clearing obstacles and filling the anti-tank ditch so that the tanks could move forward. The perimeter defenses were quickly cut through by the attack, and the British would find that some Italian units quickly surrendered, while others would persist in the fight for much longer. But as soon as the first attack made it through the perimeter, it was really only a matter of time before the entirety of the defenses were rolled up. It was over by midday on the 22nd of January, just over a day from when the attack began. There were more Italians than there were attackers in Tobruk, but once the defenses began to be rolled up, the pace of surrenders increased until eventually 27,000 Italians would give themselves up. These forces would just be one of the items that would be captured, with the general haul of guns, tanks, and other equipment being quite large. There were also large quantities of food and fuel captured due to the supplies that the Italians had shipped in via the harbor, but had not used and had also failed to destroy. For all of this, a considerable amount of booty, the 6th Division lost just 49 killed and 305 men wounded. The capture of Tobruk, much like Bardia and Sidi Barrani before it, caused Wavell's eyes to once again drift further west to the next major target. And this was partially because the Italian 10th Army appeared to be somehow in an even worse position than they had been before, and there seemed to be little standing between the British forces and Benghazi, really, which would have been the next great prize. But to make the jump to Benghazi would have required an advance of further than the British had advanced up to that point during Operation Compass. And O'Connor wanted to be even more ambitious with his planning, because instead of just advancing along the coast, hopping from one coastal town to the next all the way to Benghazi, he wanted to split his forces into two, with some moving along the coast just as they had up to that point, but the other group would instead cut across the desert. This was a bold move, and the troops that went across the desert would have to advance several hundred kilometers before they reached the coast again at Beda Fomm. But if they could make that jump, then they would be able to cut off the retreat of all of the Italian forces between Tobruk and Benghazi. It would be a tremendous victory, and the risk seemed worth it due to the complete lack of real resistance from the Italians outside of their coastal fortresses up to that point in the operation. These decisions would set the course for the next part of the campaign. And first, we will discuss the events along the coast at the town of Derna. Derna was around 120 kilometers to the west of Tobruk along the coast road. It was the expected route of the British advance, and in recognition of this, Italian reinforcements had been sent from the west to bolster the defense of the 60th Infantry Division at Derna. These reinforcements had not, at this point, been engaged in the campaign and would arrive before the British would arrive for their attack. They would also have 120 tanks with them, which provided the Italians with a numerical advantage in medium tanks for the first time since the start of the war. This also meant that the forward units of the 6th Australian Division arrived outside Derna, but they found that the Italian positions were quite well prepared and defended. They couldn't just roll them up, as they had in several cases up to that point. To make matters worse, the terrain around Derna was very rugged, which greatly benefited the Italian defenders. One of the key points in the defense of Derna was the airstrip outside of town, with it being attacked by Australian infantry throughout the day on January 25th. The key difference maker would be the British artillery, which would support the infantry as they ground forward, first through the airstrip and then onto the ridges overlooking the town. As the British advance continued to push towards the town and around the town, the Italians would eventually be forced to surrender Derna to the British, and suddenly the British would have Derna in their possessions and would almost immediately begin to push further west in the wake of the retreating Italians. The British would also have to find a way to handle 100,000 civilians that had been in Derna at the time of its capture, which was one of the first times that they would have to deal with a significant number of civilians within what was previously a part of Italian Libya. While the 6th Australian Division was moving towards Derna, to the south, the 7th Armoured Division was pushing towards its first major objective through the desert, the town of Mekelle. The greatest challenges on this advance were related to the location. Maps were scarce, supplies were scarce, and the distance that had to be traveled was long, with the distance between Tobruk and Mekelle being a little over 100 kilometers. The biggest issue was tank endurance, though, and throughout the days leading up to and then after Mekelle, the mechanical dropouts in the 7th Armored Division began to mount. On the 24th of January, the leading armored elements would approach the Italian positions at Mekelle, with their primary goal being to cut the track that led north from Mekelle towards Derna to prevent the arrival of any Italian reinforcements. When they attempted to make this move, they would be met by a strong Italian response, including a force of Italian M1340 tanks, which were a reasonable match for the light British tanks that were supposed to be cutting the track. However, as heavier British vehicles began to arrive, the tide turned against the Italians. Over the following days, as more British forces arrived, they attempted to surround the Italian garrison at Mekelle, with the Italian forces put in the position of either abandoning their positions or being cut off. They would eventually decide that the best course of action was to retire to the west, a retirement that would continue until they reached the coast. The coast was also the destination of the British forces that had moved through Mekelle, but as they began pushing west, they ran into a problem. The commander of the 7th Armored Division felt that his forward elements were advancing too slowly. The problem was the speed of the tanks, as they were never necessarily fast, and a combination of mechanical issues and refueling needs meant that the entire column had to move at the speed of the tanks. The plan was to reach the coastal road at or near Beda Fomm as quickly as possible, to trap the maximum number of Italians to the north of that position. To meet this goal, armored car detachments had already been sent ahead, which was exactly what they were designed for. They were designed to race ahead. But they would not have enough strength to cut off and hold the coastal road by themselves if they arrived at that location and then the Italians attacked. The plan and the hope was that there would be a large number of Italian troops trapped to the north of the roadblock that would be created, but they would be desperate to break through any British blockade. A small armored car detachment would simply be overwhelmed if they did not have support. Therefore, the decision was made to detach only the fastest collection of vehicles, which were wheeled trucks, and send them forward as quickly as possible. They would try to catch up to the armored car units, and they would leave behind the slower-moving tanks. This was a bold move, because it still carried with it the risk that the detached units would also be overwhelmed without the support of the British armor. But it was a risk that was evaluated, and it was felt that it was worth taking, with the hope that they could hold out until the armor and the divisional artillery arrived to support them. It would be up to the British forces that arrived at the coastal road to the north of Beda Fomm to hold out long enough for those other troops to arrive against a growing number of Italian attacks.
Meet the computer you can talk to. With Copilot on Windows, working, creating, and collaborating is as easy as talking. Got writer's block? Share your screen with Copilot Vision to help spark inspiration, and use Copilot Voice to have a conversation and brainstorm ideas. Or maybe you need some tech help. With Copilot Vision, Copilot sees what you see. Let Copilot talk you through step-by-step guidance so you can master new apps, games, and skills faster. Try now at windows.com/Copilot.
This episode is brought to you by... Oops! I've got a box of Cheez-It crackers staring at me, and I just wanted that irresistible cheesy crunch. Sorry, that was a total snacksident. What was I supposed to be talking about? So salty, so crunchy, so cheesy. Whoops! Lost my train of thought. I've heard of brain freeze, but brain cheese? I'll just have one more Cheez-It cracker, and then I'll get back to it.
The first British forces would arrive on the coastal road on February 5th. These were the armored cars of C Squadron 11th Hussars, and they had arrived at the road about 15 kilometers north of Beda Fomm. They quickly took up positions, and over the following few hours, a few more British units trickled in to assist in the defense. The good news is that, at least at that moment, they were well supplied, as they had brought their supplies with them on trucks. But it was also well known that they were well ahead of the main column, and whatever men and supplies they had would be all that would be available for at least until late the next day. The arrival of the British forces on the coastal road would set in motion a chain reaction of events that would result in the Battle of Beda Fomm, which would last from the 5th until the 7th of February. As soon as the British forces were in place, on the Italian side, chaos began to reign. The retreating Italian forces were not prepared for any kind of action, and they simply had been trying to move along the road as quickly as possible. The first actions by the British forces were not defending against Italian attacks, but simply firing on unsuspecting Italian vehicles. The first trucks had no idea that the British were even there when the firing started. This meant that when they were confronted by the British roadblock, they simply halted, resulting in a massive traffic jam that quickly extended over 30 kilometers to the north. The first real effort by the Italians to break through the British was made later in the afternoon on the 5th. Again, the Italian forces were caught by British fire before they could really begin their attack, and it was quickly over. While the situation had been developing around the first set of British forces to arrive, other units were also trickling in from the east. This included more units of the 7th Armored, including the 7th Hussars, which brought with them their own light tanks, along with a handful of medium tanks that were still in good repair. They quickly moved up along the road and caught the Italian units from the side and the rear, causing all kinds of havoc in the Italian units that were still largely unprepared for action. The Italians would use the darkness during the night of February 5th to try and make a few efforts to attack the British forces on the road, but all of these efforts were poorly organized and not well supported by artillery. These ad hoc efforts would continue on the morning of February 6th, but the same mistakes were made. Troops were assembled and thrown at the British without any real effort made to determine the size and positioning of the British forces or to arrange enough supporting units to provide the infantry with support. Supplies, particularly of fuel for the vehicles, was slowly becoming the biggest problem for the British, though. Every drop of petrol had been siphoned out of every captured Italian vehicle, and everything had been given to the British tanks, with other vehicles, including the artillery haulers, being almost completely immobile by the end of February 6th. The British also only remained in control of the situation because of the disorganization of the Italian forces. They had trapped a large column, and that included many M13 medium tanks, which the British did not have great answers for. If they could be organized and thrown into an attack, it was likely they could break through the British positions. Another problem was also developing to the north, because the northern group of British forces were now also acting as a roadblock to prevent further Italian forces from approaching from the north. And if they did not hold, it was likely to result in a cascading effect that would doom the roadblock further to the south. On the northern roadblock, action would revolve around a small hill that would be given the nickname the Pimple. From the hill, the British could see a collection of Italian forces that stretched to the north, packing the road and spilling out onto both sides. Brigadier John Conter commanded the 4th Armored Brigade, which occupied this position, and he was determined to hold it for as long as possible. All of the British moves over the previous days had placed the Italian commander, General Bergonzoli, in a horrible position, and it was difficult for him to see an easy way out. The most surefire way to push through the British forces to his south was to bring the Babini Armored Brigade from the north and simply punch through, and that almost certainly would have worked. However, that brigade was currently defending against the advance of the Australians towards Benghazi, and moving it would essentially force the Italians to give up the city, and so he couldn't really do that. With that unit rejected, the best course of action seemed to be to try and bring together enough armor within the column itself to push through, and these were the orders that were given. The first effort was made by 10 M13s, which moved off the road and proceeded south towards the Pimple alongside the road. They had the unfortunate luck of being the first attack against the British tanks on the Pimple, and it would go very poorly. The British cruiser tanks, over a dozen of them, were perfectly positioned to engage the Italian attacks, and they were able to quickly destroy or disable all 10 of the Italian attackers. Small units of M13s would then be engaged by other British units from a variety of different angles off the road as they also tried to move forward to join in the attack. The various actions during this time are a perfect example of what a small but very well organized and positioned unit can do against a larger but uncoordinated group. The Italian tanks simply never had a chance as they were constantly being engaged by British forces that they could not even really see, and which were also using the cover of the surrounding hills to move safely while the Italians were constantly exposed. But while the Italian armor attacks were completely hopeless, while they were occurring, more and more organization was occurring on the Italian side. Most importantly for the Italians, their artillery was starting to assert itself on the battlefield, and they would quickly destroy several British tanks as they began to drop shells on the British positions on and around the Pimple. Efforts were made by the 3rd and 7th Hussars to increase their harassment of the Italian column, as they were positioned even further north than the Pimple, but when they were confronted by the overwhelming number of Italian tanks and infantry units, which were now supported by artillery, they were forced to back off. More pressure mounted on the cruiser tanks on the Pimple as well, with the added stress of dwindling ammunition stocks being sort of added on to all the other problems that were occurring. In the afternoon, the position would have to be abandoned due to the lack of ammunition, when, just in time, a group of ammunition trucks arrived near the position. Over the next hour, the tanks cycled back away from the line to refill their magazines, and further to the north, the 7th Hussars, having moved further north even than they were before, were attacking the rear of the Italian column. By the middle of the afternoon, there were multiple actions happening all along the road, and the British positions were in danger of being overwhelmed entirely. Italian attacks had also moved off the road to the west, away from the Pimple, and had begun to pass southwards towards the southern roadblock, putting it in danger as well. The combination of Italian infantry and artillery attacks had also pushed the British off of many of their positions, including the one on the Pimple, which now was being used by the Italians to push the British further back. There was a lot of bad news for the British happening here. They were sort of slowly being overwhelmed. But there was some good news, because the 7th Armored Brigade arrived to assist the 7th Hussars in the north, and their cruiser and light tanks that the brigade had began to cause complete havoc among the Italian forces at the end of the Italian column. But this did not necessarily help the British further south, and in some ways it just pushed the Italian forces to attack southwards with renewed vigor. Fortunately, some units of the 7th Armored Brigade would also be able to make their way south to reinforce the British units that had been fighting throughout the day. As night fell, the British units would frantically resupply and repair their vehicles and their positions, with the belief that the fighting would resume the next day. At the southern roadblock, dawn on February 7th would be the point of greatest risk. In the morning, the Italians would make one last desperate attempt to try and force their way through the British units that were blocking their path. This time they would also be supported by Italian artillery, which would rain down shells on both the British infantry and, more importantly, their anti-tank guns. Everything would develop into something of a confusing close-quarters melee, with Italian tanks moving among the British infantry positions while being fired on by British artillery, which was knowingly firing into their own lines in the hopes of destroying the Italian tanks and hopefully missing most of the British infantry. Smoke began to overwhelm the battlefield, and it became a kind of battle of attrition between the Italian tanks and the British weapons that could destroy them. There was a point where there were only a handful of Italian tanks remaining, but they would be destroyed by one of the last anti-tank guns that was still operational, which would be manned by the battery commander, his batman, and a cook, because the crew had already been killed. When these final tanks were disabled, it would prove to be the last gasp of the Italian attacks. Further north, the British armored units on the north side of the Pimple had begun another series of harassing attacks, and further south, suddenly Italian units began to surrender. Lieutenant Jolly had been observing the attack and would later write, quote, "Gradually I became aware of a startling change. First one and then another white flag appeared in the host of vehicles. More and more became visible until the whole column was a forest of waving white banners." End quote. Suddenly, along the entire column, Italian units began to surrender. 25,000 Italian soldiers in all would eventually be in British custody, including 100 medium tanks, 200 artillery guns, and 1,500 wheeled vehicles of a variety of different types. They had been so close to breaking through and being able to make their way south and away from the British positions, but the various British units had held on just long enough to cause them to give up hope. Immediately, the men of the 7th Armored began to organize, take stock of their new supplies and vehicles, most importantly, and began to prepare for the possibility of a further advance to the west, possibly all the way to Tripoli. Over the previous 2 months of Operation Compass, the British, Indian, and Australian troops had advanced 800 kilometers from their starting point in Egypt all the way to Beda Fomm, and then slightly beyond. During that time, they had completely destroyed the Italian 10th Army, the vast majority of which had surrendered to them at various points along the way. 130,000 Italian prisoners were now on their way eastward for imprisonment for the rest of the war. Along with those captured, over 5,000 Italians would be killed, and an additional 15,000 had been wounded. On the British side, casualties were shockingly light, with only 500 killed and around 1,400 wounded. Overall, it was a massively imbalanced set of numbers, which was mostly caused by the general disorganization of Italian resistance during some of the larger actions, and the quick surrender of the larger Italian forces in their prepared defenses at places like Bardia and Tobruk. Both sides were preparing for a British advance on Tripoli, though. This was seen as only the beginning, with the Italian commanders in Libya trying to arrange the remaining forces to meet the advance, while the British forces furthest to the west, the 7th Armored and 6th Australian, already were preparing to make their next jump. But there were mechanical limits to the British advance which had really been reached by the time they reached Beda Fomm. While a shockingly small percentage of the British forces had become casualties, the rate of attrition among their vehicles was staggering. Somewhere around 80% of the vehicles that had initially moved forward from Sidi Barrani were out of action by the time that the fighting was over at Beda Fomm. Some of these had been destroyed by the Italians, it had happened, but the vast majority had simply broken down, having been pushed well beyond their expected service mileage. Some of those vehicles were already on their way back for repair, but when they arrived back at the workshops in Egypt, many of them would simply be abandoned as lost causes. Some of the ranks of some of the types of vehicles in the forward units had been replenished at Beda Fomm, but those vehicles that had been captured were also well worn and were unreliable. But more important than all of this was the fact that the desire to continue the advance deeper into Libya simply was not present in the high command. Something could have been thrown together. A strong naval presence could have been pushed forward to assist, but at a theater level, British attention was suddenly and decisively drawn to the north. Wavell had moved on, and the next efforts of the British forces in the eastern Mediterranean would not be to reinforce success in the deserts of North Africa, but instead to try and save a new entrant into the war from almost certain defeat. This meant that the British were going to Greece, where their next great defeat would be experienced, a debacle that would see the British pushed out of Greece at the cost of almost fatally weakening their forces in North Africa. It would be, quite simply, a Greek tragedy.